an easy win to basically blame it on the Scottish and say that you're worse off because of what a Labour government's done. The fact that constraint payments this year, so constraint payments being payments to an electricity generator to not produce electricity because there is essentially a constraint on how much energy can pass through the levelling up issue, because ironically the places that would have lower electricity from this will be those more deprived areas, and the ones with higher electricity prices in relative terms will be the more affluent southern kind of counties. So it's actually a levelling up policy.
Welcome to Free the Power, the IEA's occasional series on free market solutions to energy and environment challenges. I am rejoined today by Nick from the Marginal Cost of Everything blog, who you'll remember previously from our Carbon Market Time Bomb broadcast. And today we're going to be talking about the recent decision on zonal pricing, which we also did an interview with Guy Newey on recently. So, Nick.
Hello, good morning.
How are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for having me back. It's
Great to see you.
It's been too long. So, yeah.
So this is a complicated area, and given the recent podcast, we're not going to go fully into the detail of every aspect of zonal pricing, but perhaps give us a brief background on where this debate started and what's just happened.
Yeah, so to your point, we'll keep this kind of high level because I think the interesting bits to talk about today are actually more around the decision-making process and kind of the wider ramifications than the actual kind of process up to this point. So zonal pricing in a nutshell, it's a part of the REMA process, so the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements. It was triggered in 2022. It was kind of being delayed because of the Labour government coming in, but essentially it is the blueprint for how the electricity market is going to kind of function. And it ties into Clean Power 2030 and, kind of myriad of other targets, and is meant to kind of work alongside some of the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, et cetera, et cetera. So
just for the parts of our audience that are not familiar with the deep technical politics of electricity markets, in a nutshell, a bunch of people sell power to the grid in various forms.
Yep.
And a bunch of other people then take that power and distribute it to industry and residential households. And the electricity market framework is the method by which they can do it, how the money is reallocated to pay for things and then how it comes back into the system.
Absolutely. And, at the moment, we have a national market, we have a national price. NESO, or ESO as they used to be, and Elexon, would basically manage what was the balancing mechanism, which was essentially a big marketplace of buyers and sellers of electricity, and you settle on price. Standard market stuff. The key being is that there is one electricity price for the UK.
And just again, to be clear, balancing means that the supply of electricity is broadly equivalent to the amount being demanded.
If it all works perfectly well, then that is exactly what happens. Obviously, a lot of the stuff that we talk about with the energy market in general is the fact that actually there are an incredible amount of inefficiencies, which mean that that perfect kind of process of price discovery and matching is actually very inefficient. And part of the reason for that, and this is kind of, one of the reasons why zonal pricing has been, kind of portrayed as a good idea, is because you have a lot of, say, for example, offshore wind farms off the northern coast of Scotland producing electricity, but no means of actually getting it to the end consumer, by which I mean, there is a predominance of electricity demand in the south of England, but the electricity is being generated off the northern coast of Scotland. These are obviously simplifying kind of narratives.
So the national pricing model that we have at the moment encourages the misallocation of sources of supply like Scottish wind farms, and underserves potentially the south, or perhaps better phrased as not providing the right incentives for the massive amount of energy generation investment that's needed closer to where people live.
100%. And, there is, again, we only have so long that we can talk today about this. There are so many issues we can talk about. But the fact that constraint payments this year, so constraint payments being payments to an electricity generator to not produce electricity because there is essentially a constraint on how much energy can pass through. The kind of, essentially they're called gates, the borders, like between regional transmission areas and sectors or zones, kind of picky terminology. But you can't physically move it beyond that border because the infrastructure isn't set up. So you pay them to not produce. When that happens, that you still have to source the electricity from somewhere. So then you have to go back in And invariably, who is the kind of supplier of last choice? It will be a gas-powered generator who's going to kind of do that. And so the kind of false narrative around gas setting the price and gas being too high, etc. This is actually part of the process of like, well, of course, because you couldn't move the offshore wind power to where it was needed. So now you've had to go cap in hand, and the last minute someone will say, hey, do you mind just turning on for us?
So these are the kind of issues that people recognise. Guy and the Energy Catapult Centre in particular many years ago. And they started this debate. And everybody a year ago was getting very excited about zonal pricing as being a way of stopping these problems happening, or at least helping to address it. So what went wrong?
Well, this is where, so I put out a piece recently which kind of discussed and it basically tried to create a causal narrative of like, how did we get to this point? And so there's a couple of things to sort of say, when we're kind of looking, a lot of this discussion today is actually going to be looking at some of the kind of more behavioural economic side of things, kind of looking at the kind of biases, etc., that kind of influence our decision-making processes. And I think they're particularly apt in this and have wider, there's kind of wider ramifications for government policy in general as a result of what we've seen here. So, for example, I'm very much, and I've hand cards on the table, I am in favour of zonal pricing. I think it solves the issue of constraint payments. I think it gives extremely clear pricing signals of where, basically both industry and where kind of generators should be essentially producing. I think it solves the problem of levelling up, which we've heard a lot about from government, and yet, kind of seems to have quietly gone to the wayside on this issue, because it is a levelling up issue, because ironically, the places that would have lower electricity from this will be those more deprived areas, and the ones with higher electricity prices in relative terms will be the more affluent southern kind of, counties. So like, it's actually a levelling up policy. Furthermore, it's kind of, again, all this talk of like freeing blockages within the planning, et cetera, like this is a surefire way to give people an incentive to not be an NIMBY.
And all of those arguments are why people thought that Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, was going to take this decision. Yeah. But he hasn't.
He hasn't, I know. And so I wanted to kind of just put that there, because that's my bias. That's what I think should have happened. But it hasn't happened. And you know what? Fine. My feelings on the issue, I can't be 100% certain. Anyone who said that they are certain on this is talking, that it's, it's confidence by coherence. It's naive kind of rationalization of overly complex issues. You cannot have certainty on this issue. It's just not possible. But, you can have an educated guess. And so when it kind of comes in and they went for Reform National, I go, okay, all right, so we're not going to get this, even though I think we'll be good. The bit that's more concerning is, a few weeks ago, I went to the NISO Markets Forum in London, where both DESNZ and NISO were there, and gave us...
This just, again, because energy space is horrible for acronyms, but DESNZ is the department responsible for energy.
Absolutely. This is Ed Miliband's department, and NISO being the energy system operator. So they gave an extremely strong hint while kind of there that they were in favour of a zonal pricing market, enough that my kind of internal probability went to around 80% that this was going to come in. And then it didn't happen. So this is where we're getting into the narrative, kind of the narrative causality. How do we get here? So let's go all the way back to 2024. We've got a new Labour government who have come in and have decided that one of their first measures is going to be they're going to scrap the winter fuel credit, which is due to save around $1.5 billion per year. All good. There are many people in favour of this. Just take Paul Johnson, formerly of the IFS, kind of who...
And that's the Institute of Fiscal Studies.
Yes, who kind of talks about this, kind of as an issue. And you can understand some of the arguments that are underlying it. For example, it's a throwback to an era when pensioners, frankly, weren't sitting on accumulated wealth from assets that they have over the years. Lives were shorter.
Well, it's a slightly different debate, but look, I'm going to try and help you with the linkages here. So, we understand from all of the events of the last year that the Chancellor has got herself into a bit of a technocratic mess.
Yes.
Where she's decided that it's possible to fine-tune the levers of the economy by adjusting making small adjustments to individual measures here and there.
Yes.
And one of those was the winter fuel payment, which, the IEA thought was a brilliant idea because that was an untargeted benefit. It was giving people who owned mansions the same welfare benefit as people who were genuinely in need of help with their energy bills. Anyway, so that decision was going to be taken.
Yes. And then what we find out, and this is where we get into our first bit of kind of behavioral economics on this. There are two effects. Basically, you've got the endowment effect, and basically you have loss aversion as well. And both of those concepts basically mean that you feel a loss more than you would feel a win, but also you feel the loss of something that you had. So if you took a baseline of, let's say the example that Richard Thaler gives, who was the kind of proponent of the endowment effect, the example that he gives is of a ticket to a concert, whereby if you you start from a position of there's a concert that you want to go to, you pay £500 for that ticket. What price would you sell it for after you own it? And the argument there is that it's more, it's kind of closer to 3,000. And the idea that is the endowment effect. So like the idea that basically you feel that loss more. So this is what happens, and people who are going to be impacted, and there were plenty of pensioners who would be impacted, obviously, and it is a large demographic, and they made an awful lot of noise about the issue. And quite frankly, if they're losing something, absolutely, it is their want, their kind of democratic right to be angry about the fact they're losing something. Where it kind of gets a bit sketchier is the fact that government kind of crumbled to that, and so having made this decision, but then also spent the money on other things.
So strong and stable Keir Starmer in the national interest caved
in on that one. And so the problem is then, and this is a problem that has rumbled on, as we're kind of seeing with some of the spending, the spending that has happened, some of the kind of fiscal profligacy that's kind of happened since the new government came in, and the previous government was also guilty of this as well, to be clear. But kind of as that continued, you've got a black hole, a genuine black hole that, needs to be filled. And so this is where we get to the welfare reforms. So the welfare reforms come through, and it's going to save about $5 billion by 2029, 2030. Now, that's about the same amount that the winter fuel credit would have saved by that point. In fact, it was slightly less than, kind of had been projected to save, but was necessary because 30-year gilts, 10-year gilts were a hell of a lot, kind of cheaper. Or what I mean by that is the yields on those bonds were a lot higher than they were kind of going into November. So our fiscal situation is worse in terms of the interest payments that we have, but also just in terms of the fact that tax take was lower than expected. You're seeing people being laid off in anticipation of some of the kind of labour market reforms that have come through, et cetera, et cetera. You've got a worsened fiscal situation. So you have to now start.
So spreadsheet Rachel submitted her second homework, and it's been marked by the bond markets.
Yes,
and they're not happy. And the left wing of the Labour Party are not happy.
Yes,
and the enormous majority the government has is not sufficient to defend this policy.
Yes, you have. I mean, again, we come back to the same two themes that are had been set up by the winter fuel credit decision. There's a decision-making process that shows if there is loss aversion and the endowment effects coming in, along with the desire to keep the status quo. If that happens, the government will back off, which is what happened in this scenario for the second time. But it's a direct function of everything that happened in 2024. So now we move on. So now we've got, the Backbench Revolt is here. And then we see tiers and PMQs, which, whichever side of the kind of debate you sit on, nobody wants to see that, and awful to kind of see that happen. But this is all building a narrative that's the second U-turn for the government, and now the REMA decision, which kept getting pushed back, now kind of has to come. Like, you've delayed it long enough, it has to be here by July. So you have to make a decision.
But just to be clear, it's not the bond markets, it's not the left of the Labour Party that care about REMA. So why would there be pressure related to that on this decision?
So this is where you get straight, this is straight politics. If you look at some of the leading voices from reform, they've been making a lot of comments about zonal pricing being a stupid idea because there are winners and losers from it. I mean, it's a statement of fact. Like, if there is a market, there will be winners and losers from it versus a centralized price. Like,
And who are the losers?
well, the losers ultimately will be people in southern kind of constituencies. So think Kent and London, who've got a low amount of electricity generation relative to their demand. They would pay relatively more. I disagree with the notion, though, of the kind of winners and losers thing, because I think it is a classic example of narrow thinking on an issue, because you're right in relative terms that there can be winners and losers. But in absolute terms, paying a lower price. Well, I mean, I personally, and this is where kind of the rational agent model of economics comes flying up against the behavioural.
Do you get absolute savings quickly with zonal pricing? Isn't it much longer term?
Well, I mean, the most of the benefits will accrue in the longer term anyway, and quite frankly, the limitation on my view and kind of the weakness of my view in favour of zonal pricing is the kind of its planning fallacy. We've seen it when it comes to HS2, Crossrail, Sizewell, Hinkley, all these projects kind of getting stuck and costing way more than they were ever expected to. So that is, at its core, that is the planning fallacy of it. And I've seen kind of estimates ranging from between 18 months to 4 years. The estimates, which, the kind of the forecasts by people indicating that there was a big negative impact from zonal pricing, essentially there were two core arguments that they had when it came to that. One of them is that you'll never get this over the line in terms of, NESO, Ofgem, DESNIS. They'll not be able to get this done efficiently.
It's too difficult?
Because it's too difficult. Okay. Exactly. So that inefficiency arising from that outweighs the benefits, so that's one thing. And I really do have sympathy kind of for that view. But what I do think it goes wrong is that we are chronically bad, economists in general, bankers, think tanks, everybody, we're chronically bad at forecasting non-linear relationships in complex.
What does that mean in this context?
So what that means is basically we're very bad at kind of measuring what the second round effects are. So when we talk about the potential benefits of zonal pricing, no one's able to measure that particularly well because it's the second-hand kind of factors. And especially when you're talking about something which is moving towards...
But okay, I mean, half by that. But do we really think this was a technocratic case that brought this down? Somebody looking with cold rationality at one of Rachel's spreadsheets and going, well, on the one hand, these benefits in year 1 to 5 and these benefits in years 5 to 20. Or going back to your earlier point, do we think it's simply the politics of too many difficult decisions?
Absolutely. So as you can see, this is zonal pricing. It is such an emotive issue within the kind of energy space. They're easy to go off on a tangent. To go back to what I originally said, you can never have 100% confidence in what the outcome would be one way or the other. And you could be marginally disappointed in the decision. But if it's made on the basis of proper forecasts and everything else, fine. Because I understand there are limitations to my case that I'm proposing. But no, it's not. Because what we're really talking about here is certain kind of elements of the media and political parties as well, kind of lining up the wagons to say that people are going to make and people are going to lose money, or more to the point, people are going to lose money. They're setting up specifically kind of on the one hand saying that constraint payments are, constraint payments are terrible, but then kind of refuting the potential solution by saying there are winners and losers.
I do wonder how much the winner-loser narrative has been overstated. I mean, I am a southern utility consumer. I am a consumer specifically of what has now been the most expensive rise in water prices in the country this year, and may continue because there are more problems with the water companies in the south than there are in the north, or at least that's what the prices would tend to suggest. And I'm not seeing a widespread outbreak of public discontent, albeit there is a lot of discussion about reform of the water industry. And is it really the case that there would have been huge problems for the government had southern energy bills gone up more than they did in Scotland?
I think, honestly, that their computation of that was that this would be an issue.
Okay.
I believe that is what basically led to the decision that was ultimately made, because they, if you're looking at the ruling party having tacked to the right on welfare and on immigration, and then kind of had to pull themselves back. At all times, it feels as though they are looking towards the right and basically wondering how they can kind of protect themselves. And this was going to be a clear attack angle to say that you're losing money because of what a Labour government have done. And if you make the case that basically the party in particular who's doing this has got a very small chance anyway of ever breaking into Scotland, then it's a bit of an easy win to basically blame it on the Scottish and say that you're worse off because of what a Labour government has done. I know this is a simplification, but this I believe is
politics is the art of the possible, and the previous Labour government were heavily burnt by energy issues. The fuel protests, VAT on energy bills, both did enormous amounts of damage, particularly to Gordon Brown. So that's the analysis. Politics has driven potentially a bad decision.
I think so.
So what have we got instead? We've got reformed national pricing. What does that mean?
Reformed national quite simply means that you trim around the edges. So, for example, one of the things there's a lot of work going on at the moment is around the gates, and more specifically, kind of the settlement periods that we have during the day.
For the listeners, what are gates?
Do you know what? I'm going to go back because I want to keep this high level because I think there are big things to talk about. So, look, it's trimming around the edges. It's improving some efficiencies in kind of how bids and offers are matched. It's giving us more connectivity with, the interconnectors. So with mainland Europe, etc., it's kind of fill some of the gaps when we need it. Like, you're kind of tweaking around the edges. But the other big thing is trying to use, so they're called TNUOS, Transmission Network Use of Service charges, which are basically charged to the generators. Okay, so it's basically a charge to be connected to the grid. And the idea is to replicate the pricing signals from a zonal pricing market, try and replicate it through the charges. So charge more to someone in Scotland versus you would if they're in Cass.
So this is sort of zonal pricing.
It is, except that it's not, because one is, I'm going to say infinitesimal, but there's incorrect. It is finite. But like, you go from one kind of infinitesimal amount of kind of price matching between people within the 12 zones to a TNUOS charge, which, how often does it get changed? At what level? Who's kind of deciding on that? It's not a market mechanism. It's centrally designed. And this was one of the things that I brought up with Desnes and with NISO at the Markets Forum. And I said to them, it was like, I understand what you're doing with these charges. You're trying to replicate what's going on with the zone pricing market. But how often are you changing it? Are you changing it every 3 months, every 6 months, every 2 years? How much differential are you going to do? And the answer to me very clearly was, we don't know. We need to work this out. And so my absolute cynicism of that is they will be so terrified to cause any friction with the offshore wind farms, as we've seen, CFD contracts in over 15 to 20 years. And now, rather than kind of setting on the basis of a budget, we now just set on the basis of capacity within the next CFD auction. Like, there's no way that they're going to want to anger these offshore wind farms. So therefore they're not going to implement.
Historically, governments have not been shy of angering large companies, even ones that are net revenue generators for the exec, which is not the case here. So where is this hold on decision making coming from? It doesn't seem to me rational for someone to take, say, Scottish Power seriously if they're moaning about curtailment payments. Any more, frankly, than if they took Octopus too seriously on zonal pricing. These are important voices.
Absolutely.
But ultimately, it's the politicians that decide on the rules that set the framework. And the sense I'm getting is that they're trying to replicate zonal pricing in a central planning framework. And they're doing it by suggesting they can, if they wish, lower prices where it would be helpful to do so.
Absolutely.
And raise prices where it would be helpful to do so. But your cynicism, which is probably justified, is looking at that and say, well, actually what's going to happen is they're going to try and raise prices, or some bright spark in Ofgem will suggest it. And then they'll panic. For all of the reasons that are the same as why they rejected zonal pricing in the first place.
If you have set yourself up on a stall of requiring a very large amount of offshore wind to meet clean power 2030, and obviously our net zero 2035 kind of targets, at least in electricity production, by 2035, then if that's kind of what your goal seeking to, then everything else kind of falls by the wayside. Like it is the whole kind of crux of the debate when it comes to this, is that what are you solving for? Like genuinely, what are you solving for? And in this scenario, that's why I don't think they will ever be able to go down hard, because all it will take is for, and I'm not going to put names on it, like we can see in the press certain names of people pulling out of auctions, and they'll say again, we're pulling out of this auction, we can't do it, these charges are too onerous, it's a disincentive for us to do this, and you need us to do this to meet your net zero targets. And so they'll back away and they won't do it. So like the pricing signal will be lost, because essentially the people who are doing it, it's not a cold, rational price discovery. It's not a market-based mechanism that is deciding what the price is in that area. It's a person who's doing it, who has cognitive biases and underlying motives that are not about the price discovery.
Well, let's give the regulators the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that somebody at Ofgem actually cares about the bills that consumers and industry pay.
Well, to be clear, I think NISO and Ofgem are not. I'm really not throwing shade on NISO or Ofgem in this scenario, because I think it was fairly clear to me that they both wanted a zonal pricing market.
So your worry really then is that the minister or one of his underlings at some point is going to ring them up and say, well, my mate at Scottish Power is very unhappy about your potential decision here.
Yes.
And that's going to weigh.
Yeah. And it means that if you have a scenario where, kind of you get absolute disparity and you do get kind of differentiation between areas, the normalization comes from the human hand over the top. So yes, I do think that is an issue that comes from it. So I think you're going to end up with a suboptimal outcome. This is the whole wider point on this, is that if you as a government cannot make decisions where there are winners and losers, I think it's the crucial point. If you cannot make decisions where there are winners and losers, because the loss aversion by certain parties outweighs the kind of positive effect and people kind of shouting from that side. And if you can't sell that vision, and so you backtrack on that every single time, you end up with suboptimal outcomes. Like it really is that simple. And this is why, we look now and we have 30-year gilts of 5.5%. We have economic growth running at, kind of 1%. I mean, let's be really optimistic and say we might get to 2%, which is punchy. But, you can already see just on the base level, let's take the optimistic scenario of 2% on growth. It's like still 1.5% difference between 30-year gilts at 5.5%. And you've got debt to GDP at 100%. It's like, it's not paying for itself. Like, and if you
your narrative last century is there's too much political interference going on. Mm-hmm. There are too many incentives for political interference that the politicians are not resisting. And they're not resisting them because they've been so badly burnt, despite their large majority, in the first year of government. Mm-hmm. So there should be pessimism or braver, wiser decisions being taken in future. Okay, I'll buy that. So on that happy note, I hope we've illustrated some of the themes around why what was going to be a sure thing in terms of an improvement to the way that energy markets operate has turned into the usual cycle of rather opaque, unclear political direction, which may lead to suboptimal outcomes if inevitably those who are most impacted raise protests about the consequences. So on that note, we don't have zonal pricing. We do have Nick, and if you want to find out more about what Nick's writing about, then do read the Marginal Cost of Everything blog. It's excellent, and it's got some really interesting insights into how you get a better system in a liberalised market. Also, do check out other items on the IEA's Substack, IEA Insider, and our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.